Okay, thanks, Benjamin, for the introduction. So just to orient you, Megan just talked about how to take the data and turn them into useful numbers. We're now going to talk about what we do with those numbers. For this talk, we're going to talk about modeling and simulation. Next one, we're going to talk about approaches that do not use simulation. We kind of breeze, I'll just breeze through this. We want the DoD to make the right decisions based on data. There are a number of reasons. There are a number of ways to do that. We want to talk about non-simulation methods right now. My colleagues Kyle Remley and Joseph Fabregas will cover that. Right now, we just want to focus on end-to-end simulations, and we'll get into details later. But in essence, what we're trying to do is turn all these numbers that we've extracted from raw data and turn them into actionable recommendations by explicitly modeling all the relevant pieces of sustainment that we can gather from data. So currently, as Bram briefly mentioned, we don't think that DoD is using it as much as it would be useful to. And the big reason is it's kind of difficult to set up a simulation model. You need a lot of data, and you need really good ways of analyzing them, and then you set up the model. You have to make sure that it's running properly. It's a lot of heavy lift initially. So I would argue that this is where IDA's strength comes in. IDA's strength comes in. We have experience and we have expertise in setting up these models, running them, and extracting inferences from them. So, and as we do it, what we're doing is we're helping the DoD tie investment decisions to readiness outcomes. So if nothing else, this is a key takeaway I want you to sort of take from this talk. Okay, so why end-to-end simulations? The short answer is sustainment is pretty complex. Megan already breezed through this, and I think most of you all understand. There's lots of stuff going on here. They all influence one another. Ramp up the operations. Wholesale is going to be busy. If depot level maintenance is delayed, then operations are going to suffer. Everything influences one another. However, you might still think, well, all the systems that we're trying to understand have complexity, and all models are approximations. Why do we need to include everything in the simulation model? So the short answer to that is definitely non-simulation models that are not end-to-end can be very useful, and again, we'll talk about that. However, there's a limit, and at some point, these non-end-to-end, non-simulation models are going to stop being as useful. So to kind of illustrate the point, I'm going to use an example that I think is probably personal to a lot of us, which is the global supply chain issue. We wrote this example 2 months ago. I worried that this won't be relevant anymore. I don't have that worry currently. So in the before times, if you wanted a washing machine, what you would do is take the money, go to a store, and you get it. You don't really worry about how the washing machine got there. And the reason you had the luxury, well, we had the luxury not to worry about it, is because there was this delicate, interconnected system that was working, near perfectly. You had raw materials, and then you take them to factories, people build things, and they come to the department stores or whatever, or Amazon.com warehouses, and then they get to us, we buy them, okay, end of story. However, 2 years ago, something happened, and turns out all these little pieces are actually choke points. And what that means is that now people can't come to factories to work anymore, shipping's all messed up, raw materials, there's no one to mine them. That means that you don't have the washing machine on the shelf, so you got to wait a few more months. And of course, it's not just washing machines, right? It's almost everything else. And what's kind of fascinating and kind of devastating here is that all these goods that we're used to getting are all because of the same mechanism that there's this complex and interconnected network that is kind of a necessary condition for us to get these things. So why do I bring this example up? We're talking about military sustainment. Let's say, 3 years ago, you were in charge of stocking the shelves for washing machines, across the United States. You could probably get away with a pretty simple model that looks at local demand and local supply. That would have been fine. You don't have to worry about all this other stuff. But now that everything is broken, your little model kind of stopped being useful because what you were doing was actually you're making implicit assumptions about, people are going to still make things over there in factories. Those are violated now, and they're not in your model, so you can't really account for the changing situation. So it's pretty similar for military sustainment, and I would argue actually even the situation is even more dire because for a lot of reasons, military sustainment can be very complex, can also be very delicate. But I think more than anything else, the stakes are really high. I mean, it kind of sucks to not have your washing machine for 3 months, but if you can't deploy your aircraft carrier, if you can't deploy that squadron of fighter planes, that's a pretty big deal. So that's, again, another reason why we're focusing on building end-to-end simulation models to tie resourcing decisions to expected readiness outcomes. So I talked a little bit about why simulation models, and I say simulation. Well, what is this simulation? We've had to answer this question a number of times now, and what we find is that it's just easy to look at it, and it's easier to internalize it. But before I show anything, I just want to say that the main idea here is that our simulation models, in addition to being end-to-end, it's also discrete event-based. And what that means is that basically things happen, and in order to extract inferences, we're thinking what kind of things happen in the simulation software and when. So what you're looking at is visualization of the simulation output. This model is fictional, it's not real, but it's pretty representative of the models that we deal with on a daily basis. What do you see? So there are 2 bases here, and let's just call them aircraft because they seem to be flying around. So these little blue circles, they are taking off, they're doing things, they come back and they sit, and they can do that because they're mission capable. But every once in a while, some of these will turn non-mission capable for different reasons, maintenance or supply. So what we're doing within the software is basically making these things happen. Supply inputs that are realistic so that these virtual units in the computer land can actually fly and do things and come back and fly and then break things, and they have to sit. And all these things happen, and because these are events that are actually taking place in the software, if we wanted to answer the question of, for example, how many flight hours would I achieve in the next 3 years, I don't have to come up with an equation then solve it. I just look at the simulation output and then say, well, look, that's what happened, and that's our projection into the future. And similarly for other metrics, things like mission capability rate. If you were to ask, well, in the next 5 years, what's my mission capability rate going to be? I can just, again, look at the simulation output and just run simple arithmetic and then say, oh, for the next 5 years, we project based on the simulation that on average, 75% of your in reporting units will be mission capable. So that's all great, but how do I know that these numbers are actually reflective of reality? So that's a pretty tough question, and it's something that we keep endeavoring to answer. But what I can say is that what we're doing is we're doing our best to develop a very detailed, actually nin by nin model, such that when it comes to the surface level of operations, that we can actually believe those numbers. So let's kind of cut to the chase. You see, what you're seeing here is now from the same model, but now you're looking at the output at the item level. I'm focusing actually on one of the items that are, there's like hundreds and thousands of these items in the model. And what you're seeing is we're tracking stock and demand for this particular item across different sites. So you see stock moving from wholesale to retail. You see demands being generated, again, organically because these tails are performing missions and they're failing. And just to highlight one aspect, if you look at those deliveries, those chunks of items kind of flying through the continental United States, you can see that some of them are faster than others, and that's not random. As Megan was just explaining, what we're doing is we're looking into the historical contracts data and basically asking the question of, if I order this item right now, what's the chance I'll get it in 100 days from now, 50 days from now? So we're forming these probability distributions, and what the model is doing is basically every time the model has to make a delivery, it'll pull a number from the hat, and so we're basically rolling the dice each time, but the dice are carved from real data. From another angle, you might also ask, well, do I even care about this item? How do I know this item is important or not? And one way to look at that is basically see how many times a part failed and I don't have it, so this aircraft is just sitting on the ground. We're calling it critical back orders here. You can just count them up because again, that's something that actually discretely happens in the model. Count them up, and you have one metric for adjudicating the head hurderness of this particular item. And I'll just make this point briefly. Same thing with repairs. We model depot repairs, which are important. You see those red triangles flying around, and then they get fixed and they come back. That's often a big source of bottleneck. We model that too. And just like for purchases, we're looking at historical contract data and building these probability distributions so that at the end of the day, we're not just capturing the mean, we're not just capturing the central tendency, we're also trying to capture the variability that exists in the real world and the kind of variability that we can actually observe. So I hope that was a good primer into what this model looks like. So my colleague Andrew Flack will now talk about what we actually do with these models.
Hey, hi, I'm Andrew Flack. As Han said, I'm now going to talk about what we actually do with these models. So I'm going to start by giving you a specific scenario. And this is a realistic scenario. In the Navy, we might ask what spare parts and in what quantities should be kept on board an aircraft carrier. Why is this question important? Well, because if you have the wrong mixture of and quantities of spare parts on board the aircraft carrier, the fleet's ability to perform missions will be degraded, or their readiness will be degraded. So to use an overly simplified or cute example, if we have too many cup holders but not enough landing gear, our aircraft will not be able to perform missions. Having too many cup holders having more cup holders does not buy you more mission capability or more readiness. But having too few landing gear does impact your readiness. So this is an important question to answer, and this is a real type of question that we might want to answer. This is a sparing question. So I'm going to walk through first a non-simulation way to answer this question, and then I'm going to follow up with the way that we can use simulation to get at this question and even do better. I'm going to use this plot here to try to describe the non-simulation method. So let me first walk you through what's on this plot. On the y-axis, you have aircraft readiness, or ability to perform missions. On the x-axis, you have the cost of spares. And this point that you're seeing is just one mixture of spare parts. And you can see in the little inset that it is the magnetic compass, generator, and the radar processor. And the combination of these three components in this quantity has a certain cost. And when you operate with this mixture of spare parts or spares package, you are able to achieve about 50% readiness in this toy example. You could imagine that there are lots of different combinations of these components in different quantities. And if you change the quantities of these components, you'll change the readiness of the fleet. So let me show you an example. Whoops. In fact, I said there are lots of different combinations. In fact, there are a set of combinations that are optimal. In other words, combinations that maximize readiness for a given cost. So let me just point to one of the points on this frontier, and we'll look at exactly what this means. You can see that on this red point, we're able to achieve much greater readiness at the same cost because we decide to carry fewer magnetic compasses, fewer generators, and more radar processors. This combination costs the same amount, but it's a more optimal combination, so we achieve a greater readiness. For what it's worth, we could have chosen to go the other way and select a point where we achieve the same readiness for a reduced cost. This method is called readiness-based sparing, and I'm going to refer to it going forward as RBS. RBS is a community-accepted method, widely used, and it's quote-unquote simple analytically. It's an optimization method. So when we use RBS, there is one major important underlying assumption, and as Han said earlier, simple models can break down for complex systems if their underlying assumptions are not met. And for RBS, that most important underlying assumption is that everything operates in a steady state. And of course, we know that in the real world, that we don't operate in a steady state. There's lots of time variation in lots of different factors. So what you're seeing here on this plot is similar to the last slide. These are the optimal points from RBS. And you can see that for low cost of spares, we have low readiness. But as we increase the cost of our spares, we have more and more spares, we eventually reach a point where readiness jumps up quickly, and then eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns, where buying more spares does not buy us more readiness. So this is the readiness that you would expect to see if you used the points that are the optimal points from RBS. But what we see in reality is more like what we see in the blue line. For a complex system, we see that RBS underpredicts actual readiness when we have low cost of spares and overpredicts readiness when we have high cost of spares. Why is this? Well, the main reason is that, as I said, RBS expects that the world is operating in a steady state. But we know that's not the case. RBS doesn't know about things like supply system bottlenecks. So maybe there's a component, and most of the time it's, as Megan described, most of the time it's procured very quickly, but sometimes that procurement time is quite long. And when it's quite long, it has an outsized impact on readiness. RBS doesn't know about that. RBS doesn't know about feast or famine flight operations. So in other words, we tend to fly in a very regular, in sort of a consistent way. But sometimes we have to surge and fly much more much more intensely. And when we fly more flight hours, we break more. And when you break more, aircraft are down more, you cost more money, your readiness is impacted. Again, RBS doesn't know about this. And lots of other time-varying inputs that we know exist in the real world that RBS can't know about. So the takeaway here is that RBS alone doesn't capture this real-life variability, and so that's where simulation is going to come in. Simulation makes RBS better because we can stress test outputs from simulation in realistic scenarios. So using one of the examples from my previous slides, if we take an RBS output, an optimal spares package, and test it in our simulation, we can see how that spares package performs. We can see the impact on readiness. We can see what happens when we fly those feast or famine flight operations, or what happens when we sometimes draw from a really long right-tailed distribution. We can examine the effects, and then we can learn on a component-by-component basis from the outputs of our simulation, and we can use that to massage our spares packages, our spares recommendations. So, for example, again, from our simulation, we might have noticed that a particular component, when there's a very long procurement lead time that occurs, that has an outsized impact on readiness. And so we know that if we should massage our spares package by saying we should add one additional magnetic compass to our spares package, or one fewer radar processor. So in this way, we've taken the output from RBS, which was very good to begin with, but we've improved it because we've learned how it performs under realistic operations. But there's an additional bonus here, and as Han mentioned, because we're using discrete event simulation and tracking actual events throughout the course of our simulation, there's a lot of byproducts that come out of our simulations that we can use to ask or answer other questions, or to guide our way along further or deeper into different analyses. So, for example, we're tracking things like demands over time, or backorders over time, time accumulated awaiting parts or awaiting maintenance, and many other time-varying outputs. Because we have those, we can again ask or answer different questions than we just beyond sparing. So I'll show you just one example here. Suppose a decision maker says, I have money to spend and to invest in my system to improve readiness. And where should I invest that money? And if I do invest that money, what impact on readiness can I expect? One way that you can improve readiness is by improving the reliability of certain components. So reliability improvement initiatives are common initiatives that you might want to investigate. But still, you could improve the reliability of any component in the system. So how do you even decide where to start? Well, because our simulations were tracking things like demands over time, and because we know some of the metadata about these components, about how much they cost to procure and repair, we can produce a plot like you see here on the left. And that plot shows us which components have accumulated the most demands over the course of the simulation, and how much does it cost when we do incur a demand for that component. And so by looking at a plot like this, we can find points that are in the upper right. These are components that are demanded a lot and cost a lot when they fail. So those are really good candidates for improving the reliability. If we improve the reliability of those components, we can expect that there may be an improvement in the readiness for the overall system. So the decision maker might say, okay, I have a certain amount of money that I can invest, and I think that I can achieve a 10% improvement in reliability for these components, or I can invest more, and I think I can achieve a 20% reliability improvement. What can I expect the impact to be on my readiness? So what we'll do is we will change the inputs to our simulation. We'll increase the reliability for this set of components by 10 or 20% and rerun everything and try to tie the outcome, the readiness outcome, to the investment decision. And again, we can compare that to a baseline where we do nothing. This is just a notional example, but you can see that we can follow the trajectory of the readiness over time. We can see we can sort of rack and stack the different initiatives, decide where is is this investment worth my money, and is it worth doing either of these compared to doing nothing? So this is just one example of a way that by using the outputs of our simulation, we're able to first help target where to spend money, where you might want to invest money, and then what the impact on readiness is if you do. We do lots of these types of studies in our group, and so this, again, is just a notional one, but just gives you a sense of the power of making use of some of the byproducts that we get from our running our discrete event simulations. Next talk, I'll take questions after this, and after my talk, we'll move on to my colleagues Joseph Fabricius and Kyle Remley, and they'll be talking about these cross-cutting data analyses, but instead of using simulation, their examples will show you how the types of studies that we can perform without using simulation and the power of those. So I'm happy to take questions on this talk. Okay.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Rathsam. I'm from NASA. Just a question about sort of the older method, the RBS you were describing. Mm-hmm. How were those estimates developed?
Well, so it isn't. So the ones I was showing is just an example, but so it's an optimization method, and actually I don't have as much background on the mathematics behind it, so I don't know if anyone else from my group can add more here, but.
Yeah, basically. You get in front of the microphone.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but you know more about the math than I do.
Well, it's a very good question.
Yeah.
So basically RBS will look at what spare stock you have on hand, and then it'll basically go and say, okay, I can buy the next thing, whether I can buy the next flux capacitor or the next cup holder. And then I will determine, now that I've got the n+1 flux capacitor or the n+1 cup holder, how many back orders should I expect to see based on average statistical distributions for the demand for both of those items. And what it'll do is it'll say, okay, I'm going to get fewer back orders for my money by buying the n+1 flux capacitor over the cup holder. And so it'll do that for however much money you have. So if you have $500,000, it'll say, I'll buy flux capacitor, cup holder, flux capacitor. And then if you have $600,000, it'll buy a different distribution. And basically, I view it as like a back orders minimizer. Is essentially what it is essentially what it does. I think the technical term they use for it is marginal analysis, but I also like to think about it sort of like a gradient descent kind of a method.
One of the keys of it is that it is, I got my hand slapped by Kyle when I called it closed form, because it's not technically closed form, because but it is the thing where if you run it, you are guaranteed to converge on. You won't find a local minimum or local maximum. You'll find the Pareto optimal answer. And as I think a couple people mentioned, the key weakness is it assumes a flat world. It assumes everything is steady state. It assumes everything is averages, yeah, effectively. So it just doesn't understand before and after. It's saying as you integrate to infinity, the average number of back orders is 5 1/4. And if we buy one more, we get so.